The Masterclass on Making Intelligent Use of Intelligent Technology by Professor Soumitra Dutta has been interesting and informative. Now we have a question and answer round. Our first question is: in what ways can intelligent technology be designed to be inclusive and accessible to diverse populations?
The technology access is a multifaceted issue. So one is, of course, having the device and the connectivity. So you need a phone or some device, you need the data connection. So that is a very, very important first priority. In India, that was done through essentially the private telecom companies, largely Geo. And I must say the government did not really play a very important role in the access part out there. Then there's a very important notion of the skills and the knowledge education to access whatever is there online. If a farmer cannot even understand or analyze the data required to know what kind of prices or what kind of timing to sell, the online thing is not very useful. So the actual skills is a very important issue. So I know that we are making some progress on it, but we all know in India, skills is a major gap area. And the third thing is content. You need the content also, and content has to be in local language, has to be accessible. And we all know that having content in all the different Indian languages is still a challenge. Now, of course, generative AI is making it easier to translate content and do all these things that I said is necessary. But a combination of all these different elements is required for actually providing more inclusive access inside India. I was looking at statistics recently for India, and actually we are doing pretty well today on internet access or mobile access. The numbers are pretty high compared to the population. In terms of actual usage of some of the UPI, for example, and so on, is not necessarily as high as it could be, but still increasing. So I think we have made very good progress, but there's much more work to be done on the area of inclusivity. But it's a complex issue, especially because the technology curve is going exponentially. So you cannot say that, well, we've done it. We did what we had to do, and we can stay happy and be content. Because in the next 5 years, technology will change even more than it changed in the last 10 years. And how do you actually keep on, riding the technology curve and being ahead on the frontier is a very important, interesting question that we have to make. And I think I completely agree with you that making it more inclusive is important, critical, at the same time, an ongoing challenge.
Company that is worth billions and hence has the capability to lavishly spend on experimentation or R&D. However, when the same is applied to initial stage startups where revenue is paramount for its survival, how must founders plan for R&D where there is no revenue for, say, at least the few years when a viable product from the same is created? What would be the approach here, sir? Is it to build a viable product and then dabble into R&D along with the product as the main focus?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it depends on what you mean by a product. So I think most products would require some R&D to be done. That whether the R&D happens in a university context or whether it happens in a separate, organizational startup by itself, that's a different question. But let me separate out the issues as twofold. So one is there's a generic problem in India, which is the large companies don't do enough R&D. So India as a whole, as a nation, invests less than 1% of the GDP into R&D, which is a very, very small number as compared to the leading nations like Korea and Finland that have put 5%. And even China today puts more than 3%, 3.5% typical of GDP, which is a huge number into R&D. If you look at the global numbers for R&D, essentially it's two countries that do most of the global R&D, US and China. And India needs to do more as a country. The second question you raised is about startups. And I would say, the focus today, if I look at the global trends, is on startups that are combining deep science with the market application, market potential. So you have to be able to invest in the deep science and deep tech, for which you require research investments in the universities in India and the research labs of India. And this is where another weakness of India is that I don't think the Indian universities are doing enough deep tech research. Yes, we have good examples of IISc and IITs doing some work, but we need much more. So we need to be able to be inventing and leading at the frontiers, and that requires a dedicated investment of research. So often we do research that is subsidized by some source, the government typically, or the industry, and then that research is commercialized by a startup. But that startup has to keep on taking the research and investing in it and balancing the customer proximity. So I don't think you can escape the research angle, but you can ask the question, how can we actually pay for the research more effectively given whatever the stage of the company is based in today?
Dear Professor Soumitra, you mentioned about both Amazon and ONDC. What can be single most or two factors for ONDC to emerge even closer to Amazon? Further, I'm not talking about replacing Amazon, as the market in India and globally is big enough.
Yeah, ONDC is not meant to be another Amazon. ONDC is a network, is a platform that is enabled to provide the bottom-up digitalization, because largely you have sort of two models of digitalization. So one model of digitalization is large company driven, which is the US model. You have large tech companies driving digitalization. You have then a Chinese model, which is a hybrid, which is large company driven but government control. Okay, so essentially the large tech companies today have been brought under the government control for all effective purposes. And the Indian model is different. Indian model is much more, I think, democratic, much more bottom-up, much more open. Like, for example, the India Stack and the whole JAM system and everything else. And ONDC is meant to do that. It's meant to bring in different players and allow them to do different things. The challenge really is that good commerce requires trust. And the question is, how do you build trust when you have multiple disparate parties collaborating on a platform? In the case of Amazon, if I don't get the product, if I have a problem, I know whom to contact and who will solve my problem. So I know who to hold accountable for that trust element required for successful commerce. In an ONDC, that is not completely clear to the best of my knowledge right now. And if you do not actually able to bring in the trust element, I don't know who can best act as the trusted source to make sure the whole operation works effectively. Then the question is, there'll be problems in the implementation of ONDC. But if we can solve the trust issue in the ONDC implementation, then I think it's a really, really very powerful model. I think the ONDC as a concept is wonderful. It's really wonderful. And the challenge really is to now to get it to work successfully. And if India makes it work successfully, I think it really shows a different way to the rest of the world for how digital commerce can be structured.
I would like to ask your opinion whether India and its diverse population is actually ready for such advanced technology, which is growing exponentially. And how can the government cater to bridge this divide?
So I think India is ready. So I got no doubts about it, because the people are young, people have technology access today, because mobile phones, data, connectivity is very widespread today in the country. And a lot of people have skills too. Not everyone, but a lot of people have skills. So I think India is ready for it. The challenge is that AI is, the frontiers of technology require R&D. That's the problem. Okay. And as I told earlier, the problem in India is that the amount of R&D is not enough. So really, in some sense, we are not at the frontiers of even digital technology. We don't have the competence in chips. We don't have the competence in supercomputers. We don't have the competence in leading edge LLMs. So, yes, we have a lot of programmers doing, program development, but we don't have the frontiers knowledge of them. We have the capacity and the potential. So really, I think what is required out here is the ability to be able to be there at the frontiers, and the frontiers are changing very, very fast. And even the leaders have to struggle to keep up with the frontiers. Look at, for example, chips. US was leading in chips, and US no longer leads in chips. Taiwan is leading in chips right now. So there's a lot of complexity in the technology frontier, a lot of investment, and that there is no solution. If you look at, for example, it's not the digital. I told you earlier about the two waves. The second wave is the deep science wave of biology, of nanomaterials, of material science, all other kinds of areas, which is opening up a whole new range of possibilities. So the fact of the matter is that we need to be investing much more in research and R&D in so many different areas.
Please share your perspective on the top 3 to 5 priorities for digital transformation of India to be future ready in the context of the ongoing AI revolution and beyond. Specifically, what would you suggest policymakers in India need to prioritize?
No, I think Indian policymakers are doing many of the right things. So I'm not just saying this to be nice to the government people who might be on the call or the government in general. I think I have been personally very impressed by what the government has done over the last 10 years. So, that's, I think, I have to admit. I think the government is doing a lot of the right things as far as the digitalization, basic infrastructure of the country is concerned. I think the government still has to keep pushing on the fundamentals of education. I think education is still a problem in India. The fundamentals of R&D. I don't think industry is doing R&D. I don't think universities are doing enough R&D. So I think that R&D drive has to be succeeded, has to be subsidized, has to be provided, pushed by government. Has to make it easier to attract talent back to the country. I think there's so many such bright Indians all over the world who come from India and were born in India and raised in India like me. And I think India has to more actively bring back talent or form bonds with them. This is what China has done very successfully, by the way. So one reason why Chinese universities have succeeded so well in the recent years is because they've brought back talent very successfully from the world back to China. Of course, there's a different issue happening right now with Chinese environment not being the most productive and most environmentally friendly. But I think there's a whole thing of bringing back talent to the country. So when you talk about priorities for the government on digitalization, I would say keep digitizing the government even more. So keep on the path that you're doing right now. Keep on doing more of it. Focus a lot more on education of the population. Focus a lot more on basic infrastructure for helping small businesses, large businesses digitize their operations is very important. Keep investing in leading edge technologies, which is very important. And the leading edge technology investments can only happen with some support from the government. It is very difficult for private corporations alone to do it. Private companies have to do it also, but you need some government support out here. Even look at, for example, all the frontier technologies in the US. They were done initially with government support, whether it's genomic technologies, or whether it's AI, or whether it's internet. And later, of course, private sector picked it up, because if it's very frontier technologies, the private sector is often not willing to be able to invest money for return that is uncertain very long time. So those would be some of my priorities about what the government is doing or should do.
Can you please tell something how AI tools are affecting education? Like educators finding it increasingly difficult to evaluate students' work done using ChatGPT and so?
It's an excellent question. I think about it every day. I talk to many of my colleagues about it, and I can tell you there's no clear answer. If you look at the range of things I said about what AI is capable of doing, the reality is that AI can take over a lot of the functions of a professor. A lot. Okay. Even the relationship side, even the course advising side, a lot of the functions can be taken over by machines. It will not happen tomorrow, but in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, it is quite likely that there will be intelligent, AI-based tutors that look like human beings, that interact with you like human beings, and have a conversation with you like a human being, that actually are not actual human beings, and that actually form relationships with you like that Chinese bot that I showed you, the Chinese bot that makes you fall in love with the bot. So this is, I think, a big question mark. On one hand, on the positive side, it is very good because you need more teachers, you need more professors. There's so many students who don't have education, who don't have schools. So it's a very good for helping push the UN SDG goals education. On the other hand, it's a big, threat to some of the existing universities, which are often run by existing professors like me. And like all professors are human beings at the end of the day. So they are worried about their jobs, just like a factory worker might be worried about his job. And anything that threatens your job, obviously there is a pushback against it. So in universities right now, you do find some pushback against AI or AI-based approaches like ChatGPT and so on. And people will have good reasons for justifying it, It's not good enough, students like me more than the GPT and so on. But these things change very fast. Again, keep in mind that the simulation I showed you about the blue water, we are at the phase at which the water is now filling the lake. So it's going to actually change so fast that we will not be able to even imagine it today how fast change will be. So I think most universities need to do what I described in the talk, need to experiment. We don't know what the future is. It's like the time when you couldn't imagine the world with cars when you're living in a world with horses. So we don't know the world of education when AI is widespread and intelligent, when you're today living in a world of human beings and human tutors and human professors. So to imagine that future, you have to do experiments. And that's what we are doing, at least I'm trying to do at Oxford, is do experiments and try to see which experiment works, what can we learn, and try to see how we can combine the building forwards and creating backwards kind of story. And that's an ongoing challenge for us right now. I can tell you that, many professors, some are very eager to adopt technology, some of them are against it. And that's a natural human reaction, that you find any organization. So how do you actually, cultivate that process and curate the process is a very interesting challenge. But that's what, makes the leadership issue very interesting now in education context.
Sir, to meet and handle future technology requirements and challenges, can your opinion about kinds of changes required in our educational setup?
I think, many are required. So I think in Indian education, there are two sides to the education debate. So one is just providing good, high quality education to everyone in the country. That's the first sort of basic requirement. And there we already have gaps. We know that we have problems with the schooling system, the school access, the quality of schools, the availability of professors. So I think there's a lot of investment required in the schools itself. I think the country is not investing enough in schools, education. That's a huge problem in the country's development path in the last 30, 40 years. The second is doing research at the frontiers. Not everyone needs to do research, not every university needs to do research, not every professor needs to do research. But you do need to have a certain select group of universities, a select group of professors becoming good at the research frontier. That requires dedicated talent and dedicated resources. So you have to do both of these things at the same time. And it's a challenge for countries like India, which have multiple demands on your time about what do you invest in. Do you invest in basic education or do you invest in subsidies for a chip plant? It's a very difficult question. And at the same time, if you want to be a leading economy in the world, you have to keep on doing multiple things. You cannot do only one thing. So it's a challenge I think that the government is trying to do some good work in, but there's a lot more room for improvement on that.
Unless there is an incentive, why would they invest into research if the funding is not from the government?
Worldwide, what has happened is, the global government funding worldwide has gone down in the last 15 years, it hasn't gone up. But what has happened is private business has covered the gap even more. So the amount of money being spent by private business on R&D has gone up much more than the fall in the government funding. Why does private business invest in R&D? Simply because it leads to more profits, let's put it bluntly. So you have to actually compete in this market. You have to look at investing in the R&D to be able to get more profits. And even for example, in the digital space, you just compare the revenues or profitability per employee for any one of the Indian tech firms with Microsoft or any of the other big US tech firms. You'll see a huge gap. And the gap is because of R&D, fundamentally. Okay, if you have more good investment R&D, you should be able to create better products that get better revenue and better profitability for the company. And that's the reason why companies invest in R&D.
Although a lot of work is being done towards regulating AI and defining the ethical use of AI, there seems to be quite a gray area. So, there's always a debate on whether there should be regulation or not, since the AI is still in a very nascent stage. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think we cannot avoid the question of regulation, because regulation is important for any technology that can have a negative impact on society. And today, in a situation where already, for example, we start seeing some negative impacts of AI on society, regulation is important, because that's the purpose of regulation, is to protect, and do the overall good of society as a whole. The challenge in AI regulation is that the technology is getting so complex and it is so new that regulators themselves are struggling with understanding what they're regulating and what the actual impacts are. It's like, think about social media. Go back to social media 20 years ago. We just celebrated 20 years of Facebook. Okay, social media is 25 years old. Go back 25 years, and Facebook 20 years old, and you ask the question, could you have predicted all the different impacts that social media is showing right now? Okay? All the good and the bad. Similarly, looking at AI today, it is very, very difficult to, in fact, predict what will the good and bad of AI in 10 years, 15 years from now. And how do you regulate that is a very important question. You don't know what the full impact will be. So that's one important challenge. A second important challenge is the technology of AI itself is getting so complicated. These large LLMs, they're horrendously complex already, and they're getting more complex every year. And when the complexity increases at such a fast pace, from an engineering point of view, it's becoming harder and harder to actually understand what is happening inside these machines. I've spoken to some of the people who are actually designing these LLMs, and privately they admit that they cannot fully themselves explain why the LLMs are doing some things. Okay? The people designing it are unable to actually understand the complexity and how it's delivering the results that it's creating right now. So that's a big challenge of regulation I see. We don't fully understand the impacts, and the same technology is so horrendously complex. But the answer is, like anything else, you've got to try. You've got to begin with some regulations, adapt it, be flexible, learn from it, and move forward. I don't think no regulation is a possible solution. So I think regulation is important, because AI is becoming too prevalent and too risky for society as a whole.
Hope you enjoyed this masterclass, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to tune into our next one.